What you're about to hear didn't just change one family. It quietly rewired how a parent understood respect, time, and belonging. This isn't a travel vlog. It isn't nostalgia. It's a documentary-style account of what happened when an American parent sent their children to the Philippines for 100 days, expecting sunshine and souvenirs, and received something far heavier. It began with confidence. It ended with disbelief. And somewhere in between, assumptions collapsed in ways no argument ever could. Before this story truly begins, pause for a second. Wherever you're watching from right now, your phone, your television, a quiet laptop glowing in the dark, type your country in the comments. The story begins in late spring, when Daniel Harper stood in a quiet California kitchen, staring at a printed itinerary on the counter. Daniel was a systems analyst, disciplined, punctual, raised on structure and measurable outcomes. His children, 12-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Lucas, were restless, overstimulated, and increasingly detached from anything that didn't involve a screen. When Daniel's Filipino wife suggested a 100-day stay with her family in the Philippines, Daniel agreed easily. In his mind, it was a harmless cultural visit. Beaches, relatives, maybe some discipline issues ironed out by distance. He expected gratitude. He expected homesickness. He did not expect transformation. On the morning of departure, Daniel hugged his children at the airport with rehearsed calm. He reminded them to listen to their grandparents, to keep schedules, to call every weekend. As the plane lifted off, he felt relief more than concern. 100 days felt long enough to reset attitudes, short enough to avoid disruption. He imagined himself counting days on a calendar, waiting patiently for familiar versions of his children to return. What he didn't realize was that time, when measured through culture instead of clocks, behaves differently. While Daniel returned to meetings and deadlines, his children were about to enter a world that did not rush to explain itself. The village sat several hours from the nearest city, wrapped in coconut trees and unpaved roads. There were no doorbells, no rigid timetables, no sense of isolation between households. When Emma and Lucas arrived, neighbors appeared without invitation, carrying food, laughter, and questions spoken gently. Their grandparents didn't lecture. They observed. Mornings began early, not because of alarms, but because roosters and sunlight demanded participation. Meals were communal, never rushed, never silent. For the first time, the children were not addressed as individuals first, but as part of a living network. It felt confusing. It felt overwhelming. It felt strangely grounding. Daniel's first video call came 3 days later. He expected complaints. Instead, Emma talked about helping prepare breakfast. Lucas showed calloused hands from carrying water. Their voices sounded different, slower, steadier. Daniel smiled politely, assuming novelty explained everything. He asked about homework. The grandparents waved it off, saying learning was happening already. Daniel frowned. In his world, learning had categories and metrics, yet something unsettled him. The children didn't ask when they were coming home. They asked how he was sleeping. That question lingered long after the call ended, hovering like a misplaced variable in a familiar equation. Weeks passed. Daniel kept score unconsciously. Less screen time reported, more chores described. Still, he remained detached. Then a message arrived from Emma's teacher back home, asking why her daughter suddenly emailed reflections about gratitude, patience, and shared responsibility. Daniel reread the message twice. This wasn't assigned work. Emma had written voluntarily. That night, Daniel scrolled through photos sent by relatives abroad. His children sat among elders, listening rather than performing. They weren't the center of attention. They were participants. For the first time, Daniel felt something he couldn't label easily: unease, mixed with curiosity. By day 30, routines in the village had reshaped the children's instincts. Lucas learned to greet every adult with respect, using gestures Daniel had never taught him. Emma learned to anticipate needs without instruction, offering water, clearing plates, sitting quietly when conversations grew serious. No one praised them excessively. No one rewarded them with stickers or applause. Contribution itself was the expectation. When Daniel joined a longer video call, he noticed something else. His children listened without interrupting. Silence, once uncomfortable, had become normal. Daniel ended the call early, claiming work, though the truth felt harder to admit. Halfway through the stay, Daniel received a handwritten letter from his father-in-law. The writing was careful, deliberate. It thanked Daniel for trusting them. It explained nothing directly, but described how children grow when surrounded by responsibility rather than control. Daniel felt defensive reading it. He had provided everything: education, safety, opportunity. Was that not responsibility? Yet the letter never accused. It simply described a different framework. Daniel folded it and placed it in a drawer, irritated by how much space it occupied in his thoughts. Data was supposed to resolve confusion. This letter created more. The first real fracture came on day 60. Daniel noticed his children had stopped asking for money. Instead, they asked about family stories, about how Daniel met their mother, about mistakes he made growing up. These were not casual questions. They waited for answers. Daniel stumbled through responses, suddenly aware of how little he had shared beyond instructions. When Lucas said, "Lolo says adults are still learning," Daniel laughed awkwardly. He didn't disagree. He simply didn't know how to respond. Authority, he realized, looked different when it wasn't constantly reinforced. Around the same time, Daniel's productivity dipped. Meetings felt hollow. Deadlines lost urgency. He caught himself comparing offices to open kitchens filled with conversation. He dismissed the thoughts quickly, blaming stress. Yet the contrast followed him home. Silence in his house felt louder than before. Meals eaten alone felt incomplete. He ordered food and ate standing, scrolling, restless. For the first time, Daniel wondered whether efficiency had quietly replaced connection in his life. This wasn't guilt, it was recognition. And recognition, unlike guilt, demands response rather than defense. On day 75, a storm hit the village. Power failed, roads flooded, communication slowed to brief text messages. Daniel panicked, imagining worst-case scenarios. When a message finally arrived, it wasn't fear that came through. It was calm. Emma described neighbors sharing supplies. Lucas mentioned elders telling stories by candlelight. "Everyone stayed together," he wrote. Daniel stared at the screen, stunned. In his world, emergencies triggered isolation and control. Here, disruption had deepened connection. That night, Daniel slept poorly, haunted by the realization that safety could exist without constant oversight. As the return date approached, Daniel prepared mentally to reassert structure. He planned schedules, rules, limits. He imagined undoing habits formed abroad. Yet, when the children finally walked through the arrival gate, he froze. They moved differently. They greeted relatives first. They hugged longer. When Daniel tried to rush them, Emma gently asked him to wait, not defiant, not timid, simply assured. In the car ride home, they asked about neighbors, about grandparents, about meals together. Daniel answered distractedly, unsettled by how out of place his urgency suddenly felt. The first week back was the hardest. Daniel enforced bedtime. The children complied without argument, yet something felt off. They woke early anyway, helping without being asked. They turned off televisions themselves. When Daniel raised his voice once, Lucas looked surprised, not hurt, just confused. "We can talk," he said quietly. That sentence struck harder than any rebellion. Daniel realized discipline no longer meant fear or compliance. It meant shared understanding. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, and subtle changes. Daniel was learning, were the most permanent. One evening, Daniel cooked dinner for the first time in months. The children joined him naturally, dividing tasks without instruction. Conversation flowed without prompts. When the meal ended, no one rushed away. They sat, they talked. Daniel felt an unfamiliar warmth, unproductive, inefficient, deeply satisfying. He remembered the letter in the drawer and retrieved it later that night. This time, he read it slowly, without resistance, without rebuttal. The words didn't challenge his identity as a provider, they expanded it. That distinction changed everything. Friends noticed the change before Daniel acknowledged it himself. He declined over time. He suggested shared meals. He listened more than he spoke. When asked what happened during the children's trip, Daniel struggled to explain. There was no single lesson, no dramatic incident. It was accumulation of gestures, of silence, of shared labor. Culture, he realized, wasn't a performance. It was a rhythm, and his children had learned a rhythm he had never been taught. Instead of correcting it, he began adjusting his own pace to match. 100 days in the Philippines had not made his children obedient. It had made them grounded. It had not rejected American values. It had complemented them. Daniel finally understood that structure without community becomes hollow, and freedom without responsibility becomes chaos. The disbelief he felt wasn't directed at the culture his children experienced. It was aimed inward, at assumptions he had never questioned. He had measured success through independence. His children had learned interdependence. The difference was not weakness, it was resilience. Months later, Daniel visited the village himself. He expected familiarity. Instead, he felt like a student. Elders welcomed him without ceremony. No one impressed him, no one deferred. They simply included him. He worked, listened, waited. Over time, Daniel felt something uncoil inside him, an anxiety he hadn't known he carried. There were no lectures, no explanations, only example. Watching his children move confidently within that space, Daniel understood what had changed. They belonged. And belonging, he realized, was not inherited, it was practiced. On his final night there, Daniel sat outside with his father-in-law, listening to insects and distant laughter. No agenda, no lesson delivered. Yet the silence taught him more than any seminar ever had. Authority, Daniel finally understood, does not come from control, it comes from trust. Culture, he learned, is not something children are told. It is something they absorb through consistent behavior. As the night deepened, Daniel felt gratitude without relief, humility without shame. Disbelief had softened into respect. Back home again, Daniel made changes that puzzled colleagues. He left work on time. He prioritized gatherings. He allowed conversations to run long. When asked why, he answered honestly. "My kids taught me something," he said. That admission would have embarrassed him once. Now it felt accurate. The disbelief that once framed his view of Filipino culture had transformed into admiration, not because it replaced his own values, but because it revealed their blind spots. The most powerful education, Daniel learned, often arrives disguised as discomfort. The children never spoke of their experience as extraordinary. They simply lived differently. They carried respect lightly. They offered help instinctively. When Daniel corrected them unnecessarily, they listened, then explained their reasoning calmly. Power struggles faded. Conversations replaced commands. Discipline became mutual. Daniel noticed that fear had quietly exited their household, replaced by accountability. That shift could not be reversed. It had not been imposed. It had been witnessed. And witnessing, Daniel now knew, changes people in ways instruction never can. Looking back, Daniel realized he had sent his children away expecting correction. Instead, he received reflection. Filipino culture had not challenged his authority, it had refined it. It showed him that strength could be gentle, that respect could be mutual, that family could function as a unit rather than a hierarchy. These lessons were not dramatic revelations. They were lived truths, reinforced daily through action. The disbelief he once felt now seemed almost naive. Culture had done what rules never could. It reshaped values from the inside out. When Daniel tells this story now, he avoids exaggeration. He doesn't claim miracles. He speaks carefully, choosing words that honor complexity. He explains that culture is not superior or inferior, it is contextual. What mattered was exposure, immersion, time. 100 days was enough to loosen assumptions hardened over decades. That realization humbles him still. Progress, he learned, doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it moves sideways, through listening, through waiting, through letting go of certainty. The disbelief that once framed Daniel's perspective has become a reminder. Whenever he feels the urge to control outcomes, he remembers shared meals and unhurried mornings. Whenever impatience surfaces, he recalls storms faced together without panic. These memories guide him quietly. They do not demand recognition, they simply inform choices. Culture, Daniel now understands, is not something you visit and leave behind. When it changes you, it travels home with you, reshaping spaces you thought were already complete. For Emma and Lucas, the experience became part of their identity, not a story they retold constantly. They carried it in posture, in tone, in priorities. Teachers noticed, friends noticed. Daniel noticed most of all. Parenting became less about correction and more about guidance. Authority became shared. The household grew calmer, not quieter. There is a difference. Calm allows expression. Quiet often suppresses it. That distinction, Daniel realized, defined everything that had shifted since those 100 days abroad. What left Daniel in disbelief was not tradition, food, or language. It was the absence of urgency, the patience embedded in daily life, the assumption that people matter more than schedules. This didn't weaken ambition, it anchored it. Daniel's children still dreamed, still planned, still worked. They simply did so with awareness of others. That balance, Daniel now believes, is what many societies chase without naming. It cannot be downloaded, it must be lived. Years later, Daniel still keeps the original itinerary in a folder, not as a reminder of travel, but as evidence of how wrong expectations can be. He no longer sees the Philippines as a destination. He sees it as a turning point. 100 days did not change his children into someone else. It revealed who they could become when surrounded by values practiced consistently. That realization continues to guide Daniel's decisions long after disbelief has faded. When asked whether he would recommend the experience to other parents, Daniel pauses. He explains that it requires humility. It requires letting go of control. It demands trust in systems that don't mirror your own. Not everyone is ready for that. He wasn't. But growth, he adds, rarely arrives when you feel prepared. It arrives when you are willing to be uncomfortable long enough to learn. Filipino culture did not challenge him loudly. It taught him quietly. That was its power. The strongest lesson Daniel carries forward is simple. Children learn values less from what parents say and more from what communities practice. Exposure to different rhythms of life can expand empathy without diminishing identity. The disbelief he once felt was a symptom of unfamiliarity, not incompatibility. Once familiarity arrived, disbelief dissolved into understanding. That transformation did not require persuasion. It required presence. Time did the rest. As this story reaches its end, remember that no culture holds a monopoly on wisdom. Yet every culture holds lessons capable of reshaping those willing to listen. Daniel Harper did not set out to be changed. He set out to manage behavior. What returned to him was perspective. The quiet kind, the lasting kind. 100 days were enough to remind him that authority rooted in humility outlasts authority enforced through control. The disbelief that defined Daniel's expectations gave way to something stronger, respect informed by experience. Filipino culture did not leave him confused, it left him recalibrated. And the most important realization of all came without ceremony. The strongest families are not built through rigid control, but through shared responsibility, patience, and belonging. Sometimes, the most profound lessons arrive when you allow your children to walk ahead of you and you choose, finally, to follow.